everyone. I'm Allyson Gavaletz from Barnes & Noble, and today we welcome Alice McDermott, the author of Absolution, our November book club pick. We are so excited to be in conversation with her today. We have some of your questions from Eventbrite, and we are ready to chat. A reminder and warning that there will be spoilers in this conversation, so I hope you've read the book already. And we're so excited to be with you today. This is our last book club of the year, and the announcement of our next pick will come out in January, so stay tuned. Today, joining us, we also have Lexie Smyth, who's the category manager for fiction, and we'll also be asking questions. So let's go. To kick things off, Lexie, I'm going to start with you. What drew you to this book, and why did you choose it for the Barnes & Noble Book Club?
Well, as you know, Allyson, this is a book I couldn't stop thinking and talking about. I loved the way that this book grappled with the idea of intentions versus impact. It sits with the knowledge that sometimes, even though we intend to do good, our impact is not what we intended. And it really kind of grapples with the questions of how do you move forward from that? And is it possible to make repairs when those things happen? All the while, it gives us a glimpse into the lives of these women whose stories history has kind of forgotten. And it's just a gorgeous, brilliant book that I knew would inspire so much conversation.
That's fantastic. And I wholeheartedly agree with those points you made. So Alice, to get started, can you speak about your writing process for this book and how it came to be, and why this book and why now?
Well, first, thank you. Thank you, Allyson and Lexie both. And thanks everybody who's here. Book clubs, oh my gosh, they will save us. Very grateful to be part of Barnes & Noble's book club. And this book certainly had two inspirations, so to speak. One happened many, many, many years ago when, as an undergraduate English major, I first read Graham Greene's The Quiet American. And this would have been the early 70s. Vietnam War was very much part of my own coming of age. Saigon had not fallen yet. So the war was very much on everyone's mind. And I remember reading this novel that had been published in 1955 and thinking, why didn't JFK read this novel? Why didn't Lyndon Johnson read this novel? Why didn't Eisenhower read this novel? Because it predicted so profoundly all the mistakes that America would make in interference in Vietnam. But on the other hand, this was also the early 70s, and the women's movement was just getting started. And I was young and thinking about maybe being a writer, and knowing that there was a category called novelist, and then there was another category called women novelists. So I noticed right away that while Graham Greene had a very good sense of the politics and the tragedy that was coming for all of us in Vietnam, he did not see the women's movement coming, and his female characters were flat and uninteresting. And in particular, a very brief scene with two young American women, probably State Department secretaries, working in Saigon, and the narrator, the hardened journalist, British narrator of the novel, sees these two women and thinks how simple their lives are, how clean they look, how uncomplicated, how passionless, not like me, I'm so complicated and I'm so interesting. And even as a 19-year-old, I thought, these are two American women who are in Saigon in the early 1950s. They're really interesting. So I've always been sort of in the back of my mind in dialogue with writers like Graham Greene, saying, there's a story here you're missing. And then fast forward, living inside the Beltway as I do for over 30 years now, and time and again running into women just, in the grocery store, at cocktail parties, in the carpool line, at church, who could have been models for those young, uninteresting women in Graham Greene's novel. And they're all fascinating and they're all interesting. But I very quickly realized if you ask them about themselves, they would say, my life wasn't that interesting. I was taking care of the children as we lived in all these exotic locations, as we were moving all around with military appointments or State Department or diplomatic journeys. My husband was doing the interesting things. I was just taking care of the family and doing my charity work. So it was very, it seemed to me it was time to give these women the spotlight and to ask them to tell us about their lives. And that's what the novel is about.
That is so fantastic. When I was reading this book, I really did notice that it is in conversation with The Quiet American. And it's so interesting that you talk about how you read it as, a college student. How has your relationship to The Quiet American changed over the years? There was the Alice who first read it, and then there was the Alice who is writing Absolution now. What's your relationship to the book? How did it influence the writing of Absolution?
That's very interesting. I love that question. I think as happens in many things in life, I'm learning. The people you condemn when you're 19, some decades later, you say, maybe give them a break. So I think, and I've read The Quiet American many times since, and I've taught it in classes. Graham Greene, it was a wonderful novelist. It's beautifully structured. And I don't think he, maybe even inadvertently, I think the female characters, especially the Vietnamese female characters, are much more interesting than they appear on the surface. In some ways, he was too good a novelist to leave them flat. And so even though they don't get a lot of time in the novel, the few things they say, if you read it with the right eye, are very complex. And so I think, maybe I've granted some absolution to Graham Greene, to a lot of male writers, actually. It's what we do. But I think it's also a matter of, there's a lot in Absolution, and this is really why it chose to tell the story as a retrospective, not as it happens in the moment in 1963 Saigon, or even in present day. There is that sense of, and maybe we should never be so sure of our certainties. Because the future may judge us differently. Maybe we need to judge the past with a little bit of kindness, maybe be a little bit more humble about our present certainties, and maybe a little bit more aware of how the future might look at us. I can't blame Graham Greene in the 1950s for the way his character views these American women or the Vietnamese women. That's who he was. That was the context in which he became a writer. It was what people were reading. So in some ways, we can't really shake our fist at the past. We have to make the effort to understand the context so that we can change the future. And I think that's a very big part of Absolution, my version of Graham Greene's mistakes, to grant a kind of understanding to the past and to the full context of who the people were, and maybe not be so sure that we would have done better. We wouldn't have seen the world with their eye. Probably we would have.
This is just a reminder for everyone out there. If you have questions, please use the Q&A model. We're monitoring it, and we will pepper some of those in. Speaking of the dual timeline that you used in the book, I thought it was a great way to structure the novel. Did you know when you first started writing it that you were going to be writing from the present day and looking back into the past, or did that come to you as you were writing it? Can you tell us a bit about that process?
Yeah, I did know right away, and I think almost intuitively. And I think maybe this again relates from my own experience of just having conversations with women of that era, of Trisha and Charlene's era, women who came of age in the 40s and the 50s and the early 60s. And so I was very aware immediately that Patricia would not be the sort who would sit down and write her memoir unless prompted. She is of that generation who says, "I'm not interesting. My husband was interesting. My children are interesting. I just took care of the house. I just made sure that they got something to eat and lived long enough to go out and do interesting things." So I knew immediately that someone would have to invoke Trisha's memories. So that's sort of the unasked question. The question has been asked; it just isn't in the novel. It's the silence at the beginning of the novel that the reader only learns later that who Trisha is responding to and what the exact question is, which is, "Do you remember me? Do you remember my mother?" So Trisha would have to have someone say to her, "Can you tell me what this time and place, what your life was like," in order for her to begin the story. So I knew right away that this was a call and response, and that Rainey would have to have her say in the telling of the tale.
Tell us more about Rainey and how you developed her as a character, because it's so fascinating to see her go from this little girl in the first part of the novel to seeing her life later on. How did you come up with her full story?
Yeah, in some ways, and maybe I only saw this sort of post composing the novel, because I was aware that there would be this interchange. But one of the refrains when we talk about all wars, but certainly when we talk about the Vietnam War, 58,000 Americans killed in that war, hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese. And the refrain you hear from our contemporaries is, "What for? What for?" It can be asked of every war. It can be applied to the wars that we're living through now. And so in many ways, I thought Rainey is the answer to the what for. And in many ways, she's displaced. A lot of readers have talked about the setting of Saigon in 1963, which of course I understand that there's some fascination with that. But I was also interested in the American settings. This is the what for. This is the post. This is what did we fight for? What did we earn? And there are two things. Charlene sees it in her post-Saigon life as, this is the safe place. This is Garden City, which is actually a real place on Long Island, as many people probably know. But it also has, a bit of paradise in the naming of it. The Garden of Eden, Garden City, this beautiful, safe place that Charlene pretty much says to Rainey, "This is the what for. So you had this safe place." Rainey holds it against her parents. You did these terrible things just so that there can be a Cadillac. My dad, the oil guy, so he could make money and join the country club. But Charlene is also, this is the safe place where we were able to raise our children. Look at that too. And yet Rainey in her own life is unsettled. She has this country house. She's not sure she really wanted it. She's getting rid of the house that she raised her children in. Dominic's house, which is next door, has all these disparate additions. So there's a sense of, in the American settings, at least as I see it, that the what for was not all good, and we're not still comfortable with it. And somehow, Americans are not so complacent about their past, and maybe really what they thought they were getting from it, they're uncomfortable with. So the Rainey setting, it seems to me, is as important to understanding the larger novel as the Saigon setting is.
Thank you. That is so interesting. Okay, so speaking of Charlene, tell us, how did you create this character? This is a woman who knows who she is and knows what she wants. Where did she come from? Who inspired her? Did someone inspire her? Where did she come from? She fascinated me.
She honestly, I guess this is the pleasure and the puzzle of composition. She honestly burst into the novel the same way she burst into Trisha's life. She just took over. I guess she kind of got me by the elbow and said, "I'll take it from here." Certainly, I guess as Trisha recognizes, I know her type. The do-gooder, the corporate wife, the head of the sorority in college, the impeccably dressed, catty, but with some depth, not an airhead. And my first reaction was very much like Trisha's. Oh God, I know these, they really can. They just take you over. They get you to do things you don't want to do. They make you sign up for things you didn't want to sign up for. But my obligation, I felt as the writer, is to say, okay, yeah, but what else about her? And not to fall into the stereotype, and not to, again, that sense of blaming someone who is a product of her own upbringing and her own past. So as I composed the novel, she became more and more interesting to me. There is a kind of keen intelligence. And in many ways, I learned that she is the kind of character who grapples with really the very question that I, as a writer, as a novelist, I think have grappled with in some way in every one of my novels. And that is, is doing good work, or love itself, redemptive? It's the question of every, I'm not unique in this. It's the question of every faith. Does love redeem us? Does love bring us to eternal life or nirvana? Does good work / love have any real traction in the world? Or is it all inconsequential, as Rainey ends up saying? So Charlene is really grappling with that in her own context, given the limitations of her time and place.
That there's a part of the novel that really stuck with me, the conversation between Charlene, Trisha, and Mary Lee, where they're trying to get Mary Lee to display the Saigon Barbies in the Officers Club. And there's this conversation that they have where Mary Lee argues that there's a real danger in bestowing gifts upon the hopeless, only to really make yourself feel better about being the one who's bestowing. And Charlene argues that small acts of goodness are really the only thing that you can do in the face of small acts of evil. And both of these women are right. And I love that so much of this book exists in this sort of both and space. Was that your intention when you wrote it? Was that something that you were thinking about while writing it?
Sure. Yeah. I think it's, and maybe in some ways this is the anti-certainty book, of all my novels. This is just wait a minute, stop. Maybe this is the way contemporary life gets into your work, even if you think you've locked it outside your office door. We're all so certain now, left and right. There's no compromise. There's no, I can see your point, I don't agree. We've lost so much of that. So in many ways, yeah, I think I was aware that this would be a book about the discussion of such issues, but not a book to say this is right and this is wrong. And yes, you're right. In many ways, they're both right. And Marilee's argument, which is her husband, the Major's argument, she's pretty much saying, what are we doing here? Here's the military wife in 1963 saying, we should leave. What are we doing here? We can't do any good here. But Charlene is, again, within her context, you don't look away. Charlene has every opportunity to look away. Charlene could be that woman of privilege who doesn't see suffering, but she sees it through her own personality, which is she doesn't approve of it. It's like, whose idea was this? This is sloppy and it's ugly. We have to do something about it. It's as Trisha says, she says the word suffering with the same disdain that she would notice someone was wearing white shoes after Labor Day. It just shouldn't be, but it is, and she stands against it in the only way she knows how.
That is, I love that. I love that so much. Something else I was thinking a lot about is that I want to talk about Trisha because she also fascinated me. She felt very adrift in much of the novel. And I'd like to know how you sort of developed this character, where she came from. I also really want to talk about, and this is a big spoiler alert for everyone here. We told you there were going to be spoilers. I thought you did something really masterful towards the end of the novel, which is where Trisha is reacting to Charlene's machinations to secure her an adoptive child. She feels anger at, quote, those who set out to do good on my behalf. Mm-hmm. Which I thought was just such a fascinating way to put it, because I think many of us have experienced that sort of feeling of, why does this person think I'm so helpless? Or why does this person think that I need to be guided? And this really felt like a turning point for her character. Mm-hmm. We see her make a decision on her own to give the child back to the siblings. And I'm curious how you sort of developed this as the incident that sort of pushed her into this much more adult space than she had previously been occupying.
Yeah, so I mean, again, that's one of the refrains. If you look at the larger sort of geopolitical part of the novel, colonialism. How dare you come here and tell me I'll be better off if I do what you say? People doing good on my behalf that ends up destroying who I am, or takes away my own ability to help myself, as Marilee argues in that earlier scene. And yeah, again, the interesting thing about 1963, the year that Charlene and Trisha are in Saigon together, it's so much on the precipice of so much change. It really is. And again, I'm not the first person to notice that. It's a sort of incredible year historically, with the March on Washington. Medgar Evers was assassinated. Of course, we all think of John F. Kennedy was assassinated, but 3 weeks before that, so was the president of Vietnam. The escalation of the war happened right after that. The Feminine Mystique was published in 1963, the very first beginnings of women such as Charlene and Trisha questioning the roles that they had accepted in life. So there is this sense of being on the precipice of change. And for Trisha, and again, she's in many ways, she's a familiar literary device. She's the innocent abroad. She's the 23-year-old newlywed from a working class family, finding her way in a brave new world, not just the world of Saigon and Vietnam and the politics of everything that's going on then, but and this is a book about class as much as it's about politics. women's lives. I mean, she is on the way into another class. She's a working class kid. So is her husband, but they are striving. He is bringing her into this world of privilege, which is not her world. So yeah, so there is that pivotal moment. The thing she wants most, the thing that that speaks to her deepest heart's desires, Charlene hands to her, says, here's the child you wanted. And she knows she can love this child, and she's willing. And then she's overwhelmed by this sense of the complications of it. The yes, but yes, I can give this child a great life, but listen to the siblings, if they are siblings or just more children who are saying, no, this will hurt us. We are suffering. So again, it's not an easy answer, and there's an argument to be made, I think, that she hurt herself and maybe even little Susie more than she helped herself in that moment. But it's the getting what you want and then putting it in the context of the world in which you've achieved it complicates matters.
Speaking of little Susie, one of the questions we got from the Eventbrite is little Susie the baby in the picture that Rainey mentions that has the birthmark on the cheek? Did Trisha's decision kind of end up being all for nothing? Was this baby adopted to another family anyway? Or is that sort of for us to decide?
Well, my take on that was I don't think Charlene would take no for an answer. Obviously, Charlene would find out that this child has been returned, and she would find another. Matter of discussion, absolutely. A matter of speculation, absolutely. Does Trisha even put those two things together? I'm not sure that the book says that she does, but the reader is certainly welcome to do that. I think given Charlene's machinations, absolutely she would find Susie another family. And yeah, that pink party dress and the birthmark and the happy couple on their way home with little Susie in their arms. That's all Charlene.
Lexie, if I can chime in with another question from the chat. Someone was asking about the research that you did to get all the details on Saigon. Would you be willing to talk about that?
Yes, sure. So I haven't been. When I began the novel, I thought I've always wanted to visit Vietnam, and I thought this would be a good chance to. But COVID came along, and I thought, well, either I put this novel aside for God knows how long, and right away, of course, I realized this is about someone's memory of Saigon in 1963. Literally, you can't go there anymore. It's not, Saigon's not on the map. It's Ho Chi Minh City. It's not 1963. And so what I did when I realized that I was writing about a physical place that I hadn't actually experienced, as a reader, a lifelong reader of mostly fiction, I realized most of my own most vivid memories of place are from books that I've read. I know that room that Gatsby walks into when it's so hot and the curtains are billowing and Daisy is, that is more vivid to me than anything I've experienced in my own life. So what I did is I went back to all the Vietnam novels that I've read and loved. Immediately went to Tim O'Brien's books. Dennis Johnson's Tree of Smoke is very immersive in time and place. I went back and read a lot of the memoirs. Rumor of War, one of the best war books, memoirs. And I was doing all this as I was listening to Trisha's voice and composing the story. So I didn't really know what I was looking for, nothing in particular, except that I thought in the wonderful way, especially that fiction, but that prose can do. If I'm familiar enough with the place from my reading, then what I need to know as I'm composing will come to me. So that was sort of the first wave of research. Then just to get the politics right, I really wanted to understand, for instance, Peter's point of view, Trisha's husband, who truly believes that he is there to end communism. Again, that sense of don't judge, don't look from where we are now and say, you idiots, you didn't see what we can see with hindsight, but rather, how can I place myself in his mindset? So I was reading a lot of sort of, newspaper editorials, newspaper accounts, not so much of the war, but opinions that people had in 62 and 63, watching how they spoke about Vietnam, looking at newscasts from early 1963, when people like Walter Cronkite were saying, now there's this little country, you probably never heard of it. We're going to show you where it is on the map, just to get a sense of that. Now what appears to us as either ignorance or innocence or naivete. But all those things were ways for me to sort of understand who the people were who were living through this time and place, what they thought, and what their worldview might have been.
There's another question. I'm actually going to pull this down because this is always one of my favorite questions as well. And it was about the dedication and who and how you came up with that. So it's for the friends of my youth. Is that just general friends? I'm always curious about the dedication, so I love that someone asked that question.
Well, another, I guess we haven't touched on it yet, but another really important part of this novel, or at least it became important to me as I was composing it, was the acknowledgement of female friendships. And again, it's not just Barbie playing, but how much women, and this I can speak for myself, and I know of many of my contemporaries and generations before, and my daughter's contemporaries, how much women teach each other. How much we share, not only, again, for Trisha and Charlene's generation, women didn't know anything about their bodies. Women didn't know anything about miscarriage. Nobody talked about it. So there was sort of this underground murmuring, don't go to that Navy guy. He doesn't know what he's doing. See my gynecologist. He's great. He's French. You'll love him. But also, Stella getting Trisha to read The Village Voice. Opening the world to, again, two working class kids, from very, limited resources, but arguing, having sleepovers and arguing about Gary Powers and discussing. This is an aspect of female friendship that sometimes I think we lose sight of. We just don't curl each other's hair and show each other how to do makeup, So I was very aware of, I thought about the friends who got me reading The Village Voice, and the friends who, would take dangerous excursions into New York City to do good, to work. So I was very aware of how the woman I am has been shaped by all the women I've known. And that's where the dedication, the friends of my youth and youth has a very wide definition.
Can we talk a little bit about Stella also? It felt in some ways that like Stella and Charlene were sort of foils for each other. Can you talk about developing that character, and also how Trisha finds herself in these friendships with these very powerful women?
Yes, yeah. I thought, again, I had a sense that Charlene's effect on Trisha did need some precursor. And to leave out Stella's role in Trisha's life would somehow make Trisha seem unformed. when she encounters Charlene, and that felt just a little bit unbelievable to me. So yeah, she needed she needed to. Trisha really needed to be sort of prepared by someone like Stella, and again that insistence on changing the world, on doing good, and of what benefit is it? And what Stella sets up is that that whole question of what are your obligations? Is your obligation to the single person who needs you more than anyone else in the world, and that you cannot put yourself at risk because that would devastate one person? Or do you take the chance of devastating one person or your immediate family or your household to give your life to a larger cause? And Stella really sets that up. Stella is from a teeming household, but she has her eyes on doing great things. She wants to make up for her mother's family's history of slave owning, even though on her father's side, her father, who's a fireman who's been injured, there's a complicated, they're Italian and Polish and Irish. There are all kinds of opportunities to say, well, my family were victims just as much as anybody else's were. So she's that dual, very American, the new immigrant family and the family with its roots in some of the terrible things. And she's she wants to address that in a big way. So yeah, she's very much, again, class-wise, they're very different. But she's very much that precursor to Charlene, that puts all these notions in Trisha's head that I think Trisha then responds to when she hears them in a different way from Charlene.
We are starting to approach time here, but I have one last question I'd really like to ask you. As we've sort of spoken about the thread of impact versus intent is woven all through the book, from a grand scale to smaller, more domestic scales. And I would love it if you could just speak a bit on what your take is on the possibility of absolution when impact doesn't match our intents.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah. And I think that sort of comes down to finally what I'm hoping the conversation around this book can be about. Early on, a couple of summers ago, when I was composing the novel, I had dinner with a Monsignor, a parish priest from Queens, New York, who was just brilliant. He was retired, but just a brilliant guy, studied literature at Columbia, saw everything, read everything. And he said to me, what's the title of this book you're working on? And I said, well, I'm thinking about calling it Absolution. And he said, terrible title, terrible. Because nobody understands what it means. Nobody understands the complexity of it. They think it's just, get out of jail free. Okay, everything's forgotten. And one of the things he pointed out was that the Latin root of the word means to set free. And Monsignor George said, to set free always involves two actors. It's the one who is set free and the one who sets free. And you mentioned earlier about all the dualities that are in the novel. And they were there, but when he said that, I began to understand why they were there. So it is that generosity of spirit to say, I see what you have done, and yet I understand it in such a way that I relieve you of guilt. And then also, on the other hand, I understand the nature of my guilt, but I have been liberated by your seeing me. And it goes back to Charlene's don't look away. You see who I am. You see what my intentions were. You see how complicated this was. And you offer me absolution. So by the time Monsignor George finished telling me all this, I said, I'm sorry. Now I know that's the perfect title. And of course, he said to me, well, then you're absolved for not taking my advice and finding another title.
That is just so wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that with us, Alice. And thank you so much for joining us today. We just absolutely loved your book. It is available at every Barnes & Noble. It's available on barnesandnoble.com. We will be announcing our next book club pick in January, but our next actual book club event won't be until February. So keep an eye out for that. And just thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you for the fantastic conversation, Alice. This was truly a treat. Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Thanks so much.